I'm certain that for most avid readers, there's an important early reading experience that occupies a special place in their memory. Something that felt like crossing a threshold, or which cut away the branches leading to some unused path in the forest of the mind, and changed the way they thought about reading from that point onwards. For me, there's a certain poem, a very well-known poem, that would always represent a breakthrough in my relationship with texts. I've said before that my experiences of English literature at school were far from positive. In fact, if I'm honest, I didn't have a particularly positive experience of any subject at school. When I think back to that time, I recall finding almost everything extremely difficult. I think of endless maths problems beyond my abilities, texts that remained closed to me, and chemical formulas like indecipherable glyphs that everyone seemed to understand but me. Most things I was taught remained indistinct or cryptic. I can't say now if it was that the teaching was ineffective, the utter chaos in the classrooms too distracting, or just that I paid so little attention that all those supposedly important things sailed above me. I suspect it was a mixture of all these things, but there was one poem that cut through the haziness of all those uninspiring lessons.
I imagine this midnight moment's forest. Something else is alive beside the clock's loneliness and this blank page where my fingers move.
One winter term, when I was about 11 years old, we were asked to read a famous poem by Ted Hughes called The Thought Fox. Our teacher read the poem aloud and paused and asked us what we thought it meant. I'm sure I didn't put my hand up at the time, but I know I felt sure that it had to mean something.
Through the window I see no star. Something more near, though deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness.
And it was that sense of the something that lay beyond the words, the something I didn't quite have access to, that disturbed me. Something more near, though deeper within darkness. Whatever questions the teacher may have asked, and I can scarcely remember now, when the lesson ended I was no closer to understanding what that something was. Instead we were given homework. We were to go home and write a response saying what we thought the poem was about. As I walked home in the early dark, I thought of the images in the poem, the midnight moment's forest, the clock's loneliness. How can a clock be lonely? What did the blank page have to do with it all? I found it impossible to say what connected everything.
Cold, delicately as the dark snow, the fox's nose touches twig, leaf.
At home I struggled over the poem, knowing that I had to write something for the next day, and in desperation I ended up asking my mum for help. As a specialist in literature herself, she had of course read the poem many times before, so she sat down beside me and we read from the beginning once more. With a few subtle leading questions, my mum had managed to suggest to me a direction for understanding something about this poem. Understand is perhaps too grand a word. Let's say she allowed me to let meaning accrue or coalesce around the poem. What if this poem was akin in some ways to my own experience of that gradual accrual of clarity? What if that fox was not only a fox, but something else too? Why not take the title at its word and let the fox assume its hybrid nature as both flesh and fleeting thought, both warm-blooded, wily animal and intangible object of the intellect or imagination?
Two eyes serve a movement that now and again, now and now and now, sets neat prints into the snow between trees.
That something which had seemed so nebulous and uncertain was beginning to take shape. I began to notice how the fox enters piece by piece, its form steadily gathering detail. The nose and eyes first emerge from the fog of that midnight void. The footprints on the snow leave their marks like letters on a blank page. That transition from immateriality to the tangible, or more specifically, legible plane. Ted Hughes has spoken about the poem's conception.
Every week we had to produce an essay. But for some reason or other, I began to develop resistance against these essays. And I remember this was the last essay I wrote. And I stayed up till about 2 or 3 in the morning, trying to push through this barrier to write my essay. And finally, I just had to give up and went to bed. And I immediately dreamed I was back at my table. And in my dream, as I sat at my table over my essay, the door opened, and round the side of the door came the head of a fox, the height of a man. And I watched him. He came down the stair, and he was a man. He was a small man, but he was a fox, so he was just a fox on his hind legs, walking like a man. And as he came across the room towards me, I saw that it was as if he'd come out of a furnace. His whole body was one burn. He put out his hand, and it was a human hand, but it was all burned. The hand was just as burned as the rest of his body, so it was blackened and cracked and bleeding. And he put his hand on the page and lifted it off, and there was the blood print of his hand on the page. And as he put it down, he said, "You have to stop this. You're destroying us."
There are many things I didn't notice about the poem at the time, chief among them the allusion to William Blake in the first line, which really marks this out as a text addressing creation or the imaginative act. The phrase my mum had used at the time to help me understand it was writer's block, which certainly aligns in some ways with the way that Hughes describes the context of the poem's emergence, barring its oniric, mystical and folkloric components. The feeling I was left with, to say something of what I feel I owe to this poem, was a feeling of initiation. A fire had been lit in some hitherto dormant chamber of my mind, and flickering shadows had begun to play upon its walls. A wary, tentative thought was, from moment to moment, growing bolder.
And warily a lame shadow lags by stump and in hollow of a body that is bold to come across clearings, and I, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly coming about its own business, till with a sudden sharp, hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is starless still, the clock ticks, the page is printed.
The poem had taught me something about the playful fecundity of language, its shape-shifting ability to be many things at once. That spark in the central metaphor, the sudden meeting of tenor and vehicle, like the meeting of two live wires, had given me a momentary glimpse of an expansive landscape, as a bolt of lightning illuminates fleetingly an open field, showing it to be endlessly more vast than one had imagined. And as it did so, it simultaneously illuminated for an instant the dark hole in my head, into which so little had yet found its way. It would be many years before I ventured out to survey that landscape independently, but it was the Ted Hughes poem that first made me aware of its existence, and for that I probably owe more to it than to any other text I can think of. I'd love to know something about your important early reading experiences, so let me know in the comments what it was that first made the synapses fire in you, or what the catalysts were for your love of literature. If you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing to the channel. Your support means a lot to me. Thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.